So we are going to wrap up our discussion of an idea that gripped America really in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. It became accepted wisdom, an idea called eugenics. Now, eugenics, as we said last time, had its roots in social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was the idea that the poor are where they are because they deserve it, and that in fact helping the poor endangers society because that only leads to an increase in the number of poor. If you give charity, if you give a handout, if you extend government programs, if you punish the fit by taxing them to have social welfare programs, that means the people the social Darwinists consider the worst in society. It allows them to thrive, survive, and have children. And this leads very directly to the idea of eugenics. As I mentioned before, eugenics is the attempt to scientifically breed superior humans, to perfect the human race. And they use as an inspiration animal breeding. Just like you breed cows to increase beef production, or you breed horses strategically, you breed fast horses together to produce race horses. They thought they could do this with humans, and they're doing this at a time, by the way, in which they know really nothing about genetics. The human genome hasn't been discovered yet. They don't know about DNA. That is a discovery that will happen later in the 20th century. And by the way, one of the persons who cracks that mystery of inheritance and DNA is a leading eugenicist who for a while taught at the University of Texas at Austin, a man named Herman Joseph Muller. Now, the word eugenics comes from Greek for good birth, and it will become an idea that will, as I said before, just become accepted wisdom. That's what science says. And what they're going to do is they're going to try to shape the future of the human race, to encourage people they think are biologically superior to have large families, and people they regard as inferior to have no children, if possible. And they're going to embrace force as a way to do it. They're going to fight for, and states are going to pass laws that allow courts to order people to undergo, for instance, sterilization surgery, where people will be forced to undergo vasectomies, hysterectomies, etc., so they can't reproduce because they're supposedly defective. The victims of these policies are going to be Black people, Latinx people, and people who are confined in mental institutions, homes for the mentally disabled, etc. And, by the way, prisoners. Now, you have some major voices advocating this policy, and let me show you their pictures again. We have them here on the on this computer. Let me pull this up. Sorry. Go. This man here, Madison Grant. I mentioned before, Madison Grant is a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, and Theodore Roosevelt, in fact, will embrace eugenics and say this is, if we don't embrace this, we're going to commit race suicide, is the way he put it. We got to have the fittest reproduce. Madison Grant got a law degree from Columbia University. And in 1916, he writes a best-selling book called The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. Note, he has a law degree. He's not a biologist. And that's true also of the other best-selling author promoting eugenics in this period, a man named Lothrop Stoddard. This man, who in 1920 writes a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, 1920. As I said, both of these books are bestsellers. Some of what they say is not new. They say that white people are superior to Black people. Racists accepted that idea in America wholeheartedly. They oppose granting Black people the right to vote. That's a fairly commonplace attitude of racists in America. They also, however, believe there are a lot of people who today would be considered white, quote unquote, and again, these racial categories have no basis in science. They want them to be denied the right to vote, and they want some people who'd be considered white today to not be allowed to enter the country. Grant, in particular, is going to divide what are considered white people today into three major categories, on a descending scale of worth. Some people are more white than others, in Grant's view. Now, all the Europeans are superior to Asians, according to Grant. All of them are superior to people of indigenous heritage in North and South America. All of them are superior to Africans, to Middle Easterners, to Arabs in North Africa, but not all so-called white people from Europe are equal. At the very tip of the scale, or the top of the scale, are Nordics. Nordics are from Northern Europe. People from the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway. The English, Northern Germans. They are at the top. And a lot of eugenicists are going to make this argument, that some of them eventually get this idea. This is not specifically Grant or Stoddard, but some eventually believe that Nordics actually originate in India. And they begin to use a certain term interchangeably. Nordics sometimes are also called Aryans. There really are people called Aryans in the northern part of India who are a lot darker than the Nordics in Europe. But the idea is there's a Indian origin for the English language and a lot of European languages. There's a connection there linguistically. So based on that alone, the idea is that supposedly these Nordics originated in Northern Europe. They created Indian civilization. They go to the Middle East, create the great civilizations in early history, early Western history, Egypt, Middle East, etc. Then they go up to Europe. They create Greek civilization. They create Roman civilization. And then they get to England and create English civilization. And those English Nordics come to the United States and create the United States of America. This is not based on any really valid historical evidence, any cultural evidence. It's just they read back and say, okay, who have created an advanced culture, quote unquote, by their criteria. And then they say, oh, that must have been Nordics. And then they use the term Aryan interchangeably. And of course, that's going to be an idea embraced by the Nazis in Germany. So there's supposedly the great civilization creators. They're the ones who are innovators. They're the ones who are responsible for science, advances in architecture, medicine, etc. Below them, inferior to them, in Grant's estimation, are what he calls the Alpines, who are partly in Central Europe, such as the Czechs, and then people in Eastern Europe, Poles, Russians, etc. They're not as advanced or civilized as the Nordics. And then at the bottom of the European scale are those Grant calls Mediterraneans, people from Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, those populations, the Spanish. Now let me note something. You might ask, well, Romans had a civilization, the Greeks had a civilization. Let's remember that the eugenicists believe that actually the group that created those civilizations either left and headed north, and then they left behind other people who mixed with the inferior races of those places. And so their explanation for why Rome fell as a civilization, why the ancient Greeks fell from power, is because too many Nordics in those places intermixed with inferior groups sexually and had inferior children. And that caused the collapse of society. One group that is widely seen as white in this era definitely aren't seen white by the eugenicists. That's Jews. Jews are seen as Asians, therefore inferior to all Europeans. Now, you're going to have an attempt to scientifically measure what the eugenicists are just contending, arguing with virtually no evidence. They're going to try to provide scientific basis. So the eugenicists are going to measure skulls, and they're going to correlate a particular shape of skull to supposed intellectual advancement. They're going to also correlate bigger skulls with supposedly higher IQ. That's a correlation, not a cause and effect. People with smaller bodies tend to have smaller skulls, and they can be smarter than people with bigger brains, bigger skulls. There's no proven correlation to brain size and intellect, but the eugenicists are going to assume that's true. But they're going to try to come up with a more precise way to measure intellectual worth, and that's the misapplication of a test that has made your life miserable in public school since you entered it. Because today's standardized tests are the offspring of what are called IQ tests, intelligence tests. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. So let me tell you a brief story about that. The ancestor of all standardized tests, including IQ tests, was developed in France by a Swiss man named Alfred Binet, B-I-N-E-T. He was commissioned by the French government to develop a test so the French schools could identify what problems French students were having in what subjects so they could correct those shortcomings. You know, a student might be good at reading but having a real hard time with math skills. You get the Binet test. It says, okay, these are the weaknesses for this student. This is what they're not comprehending. Here are steps you can take to correct that so the student will improve. When Binet developed that test, he was very clear about this. He said, the test results don't indicate any permanent characteristics, such as intelligence. This is not the number attached to the score. It doesn't say this is the upper limit of what this person can do. If you remediate, if you focus on these problems, the scores will go up. And so that's what he told the French schools. That's how the test was used originally. The test travels to Stanford University. It's, people begin to use the test across America. Stanford University gets their hands on this test and say, we can use this to measure someone's intellectual capacity. And they use it exactly in the way Binet didn't want the test used. And so Stanford University modifies the test. It becomes known as the Stanford Binet test. And then they say, well, we're wondering. We believe that these new immigrants we talked about earlier from Eastern Europe, these Russians, these Bulgarians, these Romanians, and these Southern Europeans, Mediterraneans, from Italy, from Greece, we don't think they're as smart or as fit. These Jews, they're not as smart, they're not as biologically fit. Let's see if we're right, and let's see what the effect of all these immigrants is on the national IQ. So these tests, IQ tests, are developed, and then we get to World War I, and there's anxiety about immigration. And so when this happens, we begin to have, in World War I, a great opportunity. You have basically a laboratory with people who get drafted or who are recruited into the Army. So the Army is going to subject, during World War I, 1917, 1918, 1.75 million recruits to IQ tests. And I want to show you what the scene looks like in a lot of these places. I want you to see how crowded the rooms are where these Army recruits are given these tests. And I want you to realize some things about the test. The rooms are overcrowded. They're uncomfortable. The recruits are under pressure from their drill sergeants to finish the test so they can move on to the next step. to process them into the Army. Many of the recruits, millions of them, millions of people are drafted. Many of them are going to be rejected for physical reasons. But the people who are processed through this IQ test, many of them don't speak English. That's not their native language. They might be able to communicate in English, but it's rudimentary, or it's not highly developed their mastery of English yet. Some of them barely speak English, but the test is in English. And so they're given this, and by the way, there's a psychologist from University of Texas at Austin named Yoakum, C.S. Yoakum, who's going to be one of the developers of the test, and he's going to help develop this. Another man, Robert Yerkes, is going to collaborate with him on this. These are the types of questions you're asked on the Army IQ test. Bull Durham is the name of a chewing gum, aluminum ware, tobacco, clothing. The merino is a kind of, and then you're given 4 options here. The most prominent industry in Minneapolis is the Orpington is a type of, you have illustrations here to indicate, some what is 7-Up is played with. Yeah, so I hope you notice a problem with this test. Laura Jean Libby is known as A. This really isn't about reasoning, problem solving, any other issue. To do well on the test, you have to be really familiar, number 1, with the English language. But number 2, you have to be familiar with American popular culture. And if you're Jewish and you came from Poland or from Russia, and you're in a neighborhood where almost everyone speaks Yiddish, which is the language of Eastern European Jews, and you read Yiddish language newspapers, and you go to Yiddish language theater, and that's been your experience since you've been in the United States, and all of a sudden you're drafted and you're given this test where you have to be familiar with what people immersed in American culture are familiar, mainstream American culture, dominant American culture. You're going to do really badly. And let me point out one other thing too. This test is based on an assumption that I don't think is at all valid scientifically. That is, that there's something that IQ researchers call G, which stands for general intelligence. That somehow there's a quality of the mind that is consistent across abilities that can be measured by these tests. So I want you to think about this as a thought experiment. What are all the things that the mind does? It calculates, it estimates, it interprets, it intuits, it anticipates a wide variety of problems it encounters. But it also creates, it also communicates. So let's think about what standardized tests and IQ tests generally ask you to do. They ask you a lot of math-related problems. They ask you logic problems. They ask you to figure out passages of literature or to write something based on a prompt. So they're communication skills. And in this case, they ask a lot of what we call today trivia questions. Here's what they don't do. They don't say, okay, you're making a minimum wage salary. You have 2 weeks to your next paycheck. The price of oil has gone up, which means the price of gasoline has gone up. You have X number of kids who need this much just to make it through the day, and you need to make it through the day. You have to pay your rent. You have to pay your utility bill so you're not in the dark. How do you make your small salary stretch through the 2 weeks? How do you safely navigate a street in a neighborhood that's dangerous so you don't get shot? There are certain things you can't control, but is there anything you can do to minimize your risk? Here's a blank sheet of paper. Write a piece of music. Here's a canvas. Paint something that's compelling art. When you're conversing with someone says words, but are their facial expressions indicating they mean something else or they're hiding something from you? IQ tests don't cover any of that, all of which are essential skills to survival. How do you persuade someone? You're sitting across the table from someone who wants you to work 10 extra hours a week, but you know you have conflicting agreements. How do you persuade them to agree to let you do that? These are essential intellectual skills if you're given the opportunity to exercise those skills. And by the way, the idea of general intelligence, even if we exclude all the things that intelligence researchers don't consider, I want you to think about two other things. Do you know anyone who's really skilled in one intellectual area and is terrible at another? Do you know anyone who might be really gifted with math and is not socially adept at all? Or someone who has language skills through the roof? Maybe verbal skills, but not written skills, or written skills, maybe not verbal skills, or, any kind of communication skills, but is terrible at mathematics? According to the scientists who posit G, there should be a way to figure out your intellectual abilities generally. But many people are like this in terms of their intellectual skills. So maybe, just maybe, G doesn't exist, and what we have are multiple intelligences. Oh, and I posit one other thing. Like eugenicists and people in psychiatry and psychology departments today sometimes claim that there are IQ differences between racial categories, even though they can't define those racial groups with any scientific precision at all. I want to suggest something, that when you're talking about racial politics in America, there is no atmosphere in which there's a white guy with power, a white woman with power, who is measuring you, evaluating you intellectually, and if you're black, where the racial tensions aren't going to affect the performance of the person who's defined as black or brown, and won't affect the person designing the test. Impossible. And I've got one other question, because tests are usually scored with points. What's a point of IQ? What's 1 point of IQ? Because if you can't define 1 point of IQ, you can't define 120. It's no different than pro football used to give 4 points, or actually 5 points for a field goal. It's 3 now. There's no difference in scoring IQ tests. It's a random system of assigning points for completing certain skills. Well, the Army's going to do this IQ test. They're going to subject 1.75 million recruits, as I said, to the IQ test. And the results are going to be published in 1921, and they're going to trigger an absolute panic. According to their published results, they're going to assign mental ages to the people who took the test. So if you have a mental age of 18, that means you have the intellectual skills and knowledge that should be possessed by an 18-year-old. That's their basis for how they report the results. According to their results, the average American has a mental age of 13. And by the way, that idea has had a long life. You see it on the internet every now and then. Well, the average American only has the intellectual capacity of 13. That has survived in the pop culture. 13. America wins World War I, becomes the leading industrial power in the world in the following years, and it's run by people typically who only have the thought processes and abilities of a 13-year-old. I don't think that's possible. According to these results, Russian immigrants have a mental age of 11.34. Italians, I remember Italians, Renaissance, etc., opera in the 19th century. Italians, 11.01. Poles, 10.74. And by the way, science, you can tell science is bad if all the biases of the researchers are confirmed in the results. There's something fundamentally wrong with the experiment. African Americans supposedly have a mental age of 10.41, the lowest of all the groups. There is something interesting about the way the results were reported, though. What they didn't highlight was that Northern African Americans in northern states, scored a lot higher than white Southerners. So African Americans and white people in the South did much more poorly than whites and blacks in the North. What does that suggest? What we're measuring is not IQ, inherent intellectual capacity, ability, but we're measuring the effectiveness of school systems and their exposure to technology like radio, where they might be exposed to popular culture because of the way the questions are written, or the availability of newspapers, where they might get exposed to popular movie theaters, etc. Well, this is going to make people feel like, oh my God, these immigrants are causing a collapse of American IQ, and we're going to be doomed if we don't do something about stopping immigration to the country and maybe going beyond that. So, the American Eugenics Society is going to do exhibits at state fairs, county fairs, educational, touring shows, etc. They're going to tell the American public that the country, in the United States, in that early 20th century, a child is born every 16 seconds. According to the American Eugenics Society, a feeble-minded child, which is the term they use for people with intellectual disabilities, is supposedly born every 48 seconds. A future criminal every 50 seconds. Truly intelligent children, according to the American Eugenics Society, are born only every 7.5 minutes. According to them, and this is the terminology they use, idiots are being born at a much faster rate than smart people, geniuses, gifted people. So, we're going to have prominent Americans, like I said, Teddy Roosevelt is going to say, we're on the verge of committing race suicide. White women better have a lot more babies, which is why you begin to have a real emphasis on controlling women's access to birth control, white women's access to birth control. But then you have a series of racist immigration laws passed between 1882 and 1924. Now, additionally, let me note, there are two types of eugenics. So that's racist. And let me just note these two types of eugenics. Positive eugenics. Again, eugenics is the attempt to scientifically improve the human species through controlling who has sex, who sexually reproduces, who has children, and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is where you try to get fit people to have children. So in some nations, if a mother has children, they get a bonus from the government, a paid bonus for reproducing. You have attempts to educate the public. So there are movies and these touring eugenics shows where they will offer eugenics counseling, where they will talk to couples. And like I said, they'll take family histories. And the man who wants to marry and the woman wants to marry. And they'll sit them down, they'll figure out how many alcoholics in the family, how many epileptics, how many nearsighted people, how many people who went to prison. And then they'll sit the couple down and share the results. They said, do you know that handsome man you want to marry had 3 people go to prison in the last 5 generations and 1 blind person and 1 deaf person? You know what? You can do better than him. And couples would be sometimes bothered by that. And there's a push to have states require that as a condition for marriage. And by the way, the couple would be physically examined under these proposed laws. You had, in other countries, you would be denied the right to marry based on the examination of doctors and the family histories. The most extreme example of positive eugenics, quote unquote, that means you're trying to get people to reproduce, are the Germans under the Nazis, where they actually had selective breeding programs. The SS was the violent, basically paramilitary force that carried out the Holocaust. They would take officers in the SS who were certified as being quote-unquote pure Aryans, and they'd put them in a room with women who were certified as pure Aryans, and they'd say, okay, we'll be back in a half hour, reproduce. That's the extreme example of eugenics in the world as this idea spreads across the planet. You have, more commonly is negative eugenics. A negative eugenics takes several forms. You have, for instance, an effort to increase the number of mental institutions for the mentally or the physically unfit, people who are either considered quote-unquote insane or people who are mentally disabled, and they put them in institutions for women or for men where they're kept physically separated so they can't have children, while they're institutionalized permanently, the eugenicist type. But also, you have a real campaign for forced sterilization. Again, the state is able to order people to undergo mandatory surgery, vasectomies, tubal ligations for women when that procedure is developed, hysterectomies, to physically prevent these people from reproducing. You have, between 1905 and 1922, 15 states passed bills allowing institutionalized people to be sterilized without their consent or the consent of their families. By 1931, 28 states, by that time there are 48 states in the Union, 28 states have laws. And in the 30s, by the way, the rate of these operations increases dramatically. 1927, there's a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell. A woman born of a poor mother who had had children out of wedlock in Virginia is sexually molested by a relative and gets pregnant. And so the authorities detain her. Carrie Buck is her name. Her mother's detained. And the state of Virginia has passed a mandatory sterilization law, and they are going to order her sterilization. And the Buck family finds legal representation. They sue to prevent it. And it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court. The majority opinion says 5 generations of idiots is enough. And they allow the sterilization to take place. Subsequently, it turns out Carrie Buck had normal intelligence. But this becomes so common. By 1941, 38,087 people had been legally sterilized involuntarily across the country. By 1970, the number may have reached 70,000 or more. And the biggest place, by the way, is not where you'd expect. You probably think it's going to be the South. It's going to be California, where 29,000 sterilizations take place. And by the way, a lot of people think that sterilizations stop. The forced sterilizations, when we discovered the Nazis were doing this and they're exterminating people because they were eugenically unfit. These sterilizations continue until the 1970s at least, and maybe beyond. British and American eugenicists, by the way, are going to be a major influence on Nazi Germany. Major American foundations like those funded by Andrew Carnegie, fund scientific research, are going to hold conferences where German scientists go to America and they learn about the results of there. And by the way, American laws against black and white people marrying are at a basis for the Nazi Nuremberg laws in 1935. They're inspired by that, where they passed laws that criminalize sexual contact between Jews and non-Jews in Germany. Under Nazi eugenic legislation, 3.5 million people deemed insane, epileptic, or mentally defective are going to be forcibly sterilized. And by the way, the American Eugenics Society is going to consider the Nazi program to be a model for the world. And they won't condemn even after the Holocaust becomes known in the United States. The American Eugenics Society continues to operate. There's not a word of condemnation from American eugenicists as to what happened in the German regime under Adolf Hitler. So that's it. We'll talk about corruption in Gilded Age cities in our next lecture. Thank you.